First of all, I want to make sure to acknowledge my LPI colleagues who co-authored the report with me. That's Desiree Carver-Thomas, Catlin Scott, and Linda Darling-Hammond. And of course, I want to thank PACE for pulling together this webinar and the overall series on special education. So our corner of this series on special education in California was to look at the shortage of special education teachers in the state. Our goals were to provide an update on the status. Let me move this out of the way. Just realized that might be blocking everyone's view. We wanted to provide an update on the status of the shortage by analyzing, among other things, CTC data on teacher credentials. And we also wanted to make sure that we identified some of the factors that may be contributing to the attrition of special education teachers. And we did that using a couple of approaches. We did a literature review to look at prior research on this topic. And we also pulled together a focus group of special educators with the help of the California Teachers Association. So before I jump into what our findings were, I want to make sure that we start with a little bit of the why it matters that we consider the shortage and look at ways of addressing it. But to do that, I think we need to look at what's happening really quickly with what's happening with students with disabilities in the state. First of all, statewide testing data show that achievement gaps have grown across multiple grade levels in both English language arts and mathematics. And if you look at the most recently released list of county offices of ed and school districts that are eligible for differentiated assistance, what you'll see is that over half of those entities were identified on the basis of poor outcomes for students with disabilities. So there's clearly some work that needs to be done on looking at what our options are for improving outcomes for this particular student group. So where do special educators fall into this equation? Well, if you look at the research, you find that the special educators who have more extensive preparation are able to boost achievement for students with disabilities. They're also better prepared to use a range of instructional methods, which is key when you consider that students with disabilities come in not only with a range of needs, but also with a wide range of strengths and assets. And then finally, better prepared special educators are less likely to turn over, which we also know is critical for improving student outcomes. So what does the shortage look like? Well, if you look at the most recent year of data, what you'll see is that nearly 5,000 incoming special educators came into the field underprepared. And I'm talking about folks represented in this red box here. These are people coming in on substandard credentials and permits. One of the key takeaways from this chart is that 2 out of every 3 new special educators are coming into the field underprepared. And that's the greatest proportion of any major subject area. And one last thing is about half of those underprepared teachers are coming in on emergency style permits and waivers, which means that they're coming in without teacher preparation or having demonstrated subject matter competence. So I just spent a few minutes talking about the supply side of things, but to really understand the shortage, we also have to think about what's happening in terms of demand. With the data available to us, we weren't able to calculate turnover rates for California's special education teachers at traditional schools, but we were able to look at turnover for teachers working in special education schools. And what you find is that over 20% of them, more than 1 out of every 5, left their positions between the 2016 and 2017 school years. That's a turnover rate that exceeds what you see in other subject areas. It's also reflective of what you see in national data, which show higher attrition rates for special educators compared to teachers in other subject areas. So what are some of the factors that could be driving special educators out of the field? One of the things we know is that preparation matters. In California, teachers coming in on substandard credentials and permits leave at about twice the rate of those who come in fully prepared. And this ends up creating a leaky bucket problem where you have teachers who come in, but because they're underprepared, they only end up staying for a few years and they're out of the field. One evidence-based way to combat this issue is through intensive preparation and professional learning experiences that improve not only teacher retention, but also improve teacher efficacy. And research shows that, certain experiences like having access to student teaching opportunities, receiving mentorship from an expert teacher who has expertise in special education. These are ways to improve teacher retention. One final thing to consider is the historical context of special educator preparation in the state. California used to require special educators to obtain both a general education and a special education credential, but that dual credentialing requirement went away in 1996. What we have now is teachers can finish their preparation in 9 months, and that often is through an internship program where they don't have an opportunity to student teach. In contrast, if you look at what other states are doing, special educators continue to get dual preparation in gen ed and special ed with extensive coursework and student teaching. In a lot of places, the way this shows up is that special educators will get a gen ed credential, and then they'll layer on top of that master's in special education. Of course, we also know from our focus group and from the research that working conditions are critical, a critical factor impacting special educators' decisions to remain in or leave the field. In particular, special educators, both in our focus group and nationally, say that high maintenance caseloads are a key stressor. In California, state law does not do a whole lot to address the caseload issue. We do have a state law that limits caseload to 28 students, but that only applies to a very narrowly defined type of special educator, and caseloads can actually exceed 32 students with approval of a state waiver. Other states do more to mitigate caseload, for example, by varying caseload limits by student need or by the type of setting that teachers are working in. And then, of course, in addition to caseload, we found from our focus group and from the research that special educators say that support from their gen ed colleagues and administrators are critical, and that a lack of support impacts their decisions to stay in the field. Finally, financial supports are key for influencing recruitment and retention. We know from national data that special education teachers who leave the field say that low salaries are a reason that they left. And then we also know that student debt can have an impact on the pipeline at the very beginning. It deters people from pursuing teacher careers. It diverts them towards higher paying careers. These are important points to consider, especially in a state like California, where we have some regions that are especially very expensive to live in and difficult for teachers to make ends meet. So what has the state done to address the teacher shortage? First off, I'll point out that the state is currently considering some historic investments in the educator workforce with $900 million in proposals. We'll have to wait to see what happens with those, but in the meantime, we can look at prior years to see how the state has begun to address shortages across subject areas, including special education. Prior investments include money for special education teacher residencies and a local solutions grant program for special educator shortages. And last year, the state also created the Golden State Scholarship Program, which will issue $20,000 scholarships to teacher candidates who commit to teaching in shortage areas, including special education. There were also a couple of programs, the Educator Workforce Investment Grant and the School Leadership Academy, which were established to build the state's infrastructure for delivering professional learning opportunities to educators in the state. So, of course, we expect that these efforts will ultimately help the state make progress in addressing the special educator shortage. But one thing to note is that aside from that Leadership Academy, all of those investments that were on that preceding chart were made on a one-time basis, and they were also made relatively recently, so it's going to take time to see those results. Right now, the shortage is severe, and students with disabilities need access to well-prepared special educators if they're going to succeed. But again, many students don't have access to that today when you consider that 2 of every 3 incoming special educators are entering the field underprepared. So what can we do? One strategy is to strengthen the pipeline with recruitment incentives that draw folks into high retention pathways like teacher residencies or grow your own programs. One example of a grow your own program is the classified school employee credentialing program, which has been funded previously by the state. It's one of the proposals on the table this year as well. And we can also look at ways to support candidates, teacher candidates, in ways that reduce their debt accrual through things like teacher scholarships. We can look at ways to improve access to high quality preparation and professional development. The state could consider options for improving access using infrastructure that it's already currently building, for example, the Educator Workforce Investment Grant. In particular, looking at ways to provide access to professional learning opportunities that we know from the research are tied to improved efficacy and teacher retention, like high quality mentoring and job embedded coaching. We can look at ways to improve working conditions for special educators. The state and districts can consider how to revise, for example, caseload expectations and provide additional administrative support. And then finally, increased compensation. With increased funding for special education, for example, what happened last year in the state budget and what's on the table this year, those kinds of investments can help relieve the financial pressures that districts say they're experiencing, put them in a better position to increase compensation and support their special educators. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks all for listening. And if you'd like additional information on teacher shortages in the state, please feel free to visit our website.